Have you ever stopped to think about the invisible rules that literally run our lives? Think of them as the underlying operating system running quietly in the background of human society, famously known as social contract theory. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to look at how humanity went from absolute, terrifying chaos to organized civilization by tracing the major software updates proposed by some of history's greatest minds. To figure out why we even have governments in the first place, we really need to establish a baseline. Close your eyes for a second. Well, not literally, keep watching. But imagine a world where absolutely no governing authorities exist. Zero. No police, no courts, no constitution. Just human beings out in the wild doing whatever it takes to get what they want. What would life actually look like in that scenario? Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with that chaotic baseline, the state of nature, then dive into Hobbes's push for security, Locke's demand for consent, Rawls' modern fairness update, and finally, we'll ask if this entire contract is fundamentally flawed. All right, let's jump right into our first section, the state of nature. Man, nobody painted a bleaker picture of this baseline than the 17th century thinker Thomas Hobbes. He famously, and kind of brutally, described life without laws as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Why? Well, because in a world with limited resources like food and shelter, you and I are eventually going to want the exact same things. And since humans have roughly equal physical strength and equal hope of getting what we want, that constant, relentless competition would inevitably turn everyday life into a bloody condition of war. Everyone would just live in perpetual fear. Which brings us to Section 2 and version 1.0 of the contract, Hobbes' security over freedom. Hobbes actually used to say that he and fear were born twins. His mother went into premature labor with him in 1588 because she was terrified by the news that the Spanish Armada was coming to attack. So this is a guy who literally built a philosophy entirely around escaping fear. You can see this brilliantly illustrated in the 1651 cover art for his book, Leviathan. It shows this giant, sword-wielding sovereign figure, but if you look really closely, its body is made up of thousands of tiny individual people. They've all agreed to merge and act as a single body under one powerful ruler to escape the terrifying state of nature. So here is the deal Hobbes proposed: absolute political sovereignty. It's a massive trade-off. You, as a citizen, willingly hand over your absolute freedom. You surrender your right to do whatever you want, and you give all that power to a monarch. But in exchange, what do you get? You get to keep your life. You get protection. You don't have to sleep with one eye open anymore, because the sovereign enforces the rules with severe punishments. We actually participate in Hobbes' logic every single day when we drive. Think of this social contract like a speed limit. You voluntarily surrender your absolute freedom to blast down the highway at 150 miles per hour. You give that liberty up. But in return, you get the security of knowing that all the other drivers around you are legally bound to drive safely too. You are trading freedom for security. Okay, moving on to Section 3. Let's look at the update John Locke brings to the table: consent and revolution. Fast forward a few decades to 1690. The British thinker John Locke looks at Hobbes' heavy-handed system and decides it needs a major freedom update. Locke totally rejected the idea of an absolute sovereign. He argued that humans are inherently born with fundamental natural rights: life, liberty, and property. Sound vaguely familiar? The U.S. founding fathers absolutely loved this theory. They just tweaked it slightly to the pursuit of happiness. For Locke, governments don't exist to rule absolutely. Their one and only job is to protect those inherent natural rights. Let's trace how Locke's system actually operates. First, you have those natural rights. Next comes tacit consent. Locke argued that even if you never physically signed a contract, simply by living in a country, driving on its roads, and enjoying its benefits, you're giving your silent, tacit consent to be governed. But, and this is a huge but, what happens if the government breaks the deal? If leaders become oppressive and start violating your rights, they've broken the contract. When that happens, Locke said the people actually have a moral duty to hit the reset button and revolt. That right of revolution is the absolute cornerstone of his update. Now, let's jump into Section 4 and see how this all gets patched for modern times with John Rawls' fairness update. In the 20th century, Harvard scholar John Rawls looked at this and basically said the whole historical state of nature thing was just a useful fiction. So he swapped it out for a fascinating thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. He asks us, imagine you are tasked with designing the rules for a brand new society, but you're suffering from temporary amnesia. What if you completely forgot your own race? What if you had no idea what your gender was, or your family's wealth, your IQ, or your natural physical abilities? If you were flying totally blind as to where you'd end up in society once the amnesia wore off, what fair rules would you rationally choose to govern absolutely everyone? Because let's face it, you could wake up as a billionaire, or you could wake up severely disadvantaged. Rawls figured that behind this veil of ignorance, rational people would play it safe and naturally choose equal baseline liberty for everyone. But he also recognized that some inequality is just bound to happen, so he introduced what he called the difference principle. This rule says that socioeconomic inequality is only allowed if it ultimately ends up benefiting the least advantaged people in society, and only if those high-ranking positions are genuinely open to anyone. Let's put that to the test with a real-world comparison. Under Rawls's theory, we might all agree that a life-saving neurosurgeon, like Ben Carson for instance, deserves to amass immense wealth. Why? Because that incredibly rare skill and years of training benefit all of us. Society as a whole is better off with brilliant brain surgeons. But does hitting a piece of cowhide with ash wood or throwing a baseball 95 miles per hour like Clayton Kershaw truly justify the same astronomical financial reward? Does that particular inequality actually benefit the least advantaged? It's a fierce, fascinating debate that Rawls's update totally forces us to have. All right, which brings us to our fifth and final section. Is the contract flawed? Let's take a step back and look at the whole picture. Is this entire societal operating system inherently bugged? Well, let's look at the strengths first. It's incredibly practical because it encompasses everyone living within a society. Plus, it beautifully captures a concept from game theory known as the prisoner's dilemma. It mathematically proves a really profound moral truth. Sacrificing just a little bit of your own personal, selfish interest for the good of the whole actually ends up benefiting you the most in the long run. By giving up the freedom to drive recklessly, you actually survive the drive home. But you know, the critics definitely have some serious ammunition. The entire framework props itself up on historical fictions, like The State of Nature or Imaginary Veils of Ignorance. Critics also argue it takes deep, genuine moral duties and turns them into artificial, contrived political mandates. And there's a massive non sequitur right at the heart of Rawls' theory. He assumes that just because a bunch of rational people would hypothetically agree on a set of rules, those rules are therefore automatically and objectively just. And that really brings us to the core issue. Even if every single rational person on Earth agreed on a set of rules behind a veil of ignorance, we have to leave you with this final vital question. Does universal agreement actually guarantee that those rules are truly just? Or is human morality something way deeper than just a contract we sign with our neighbors? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you're sitting at a red light. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you next time.